Say what? Am I hearing correctly? Why is Asperger's syndrome not an official diagnosis anymore? Welcome back, companions, to my channel. I'm Aspie Answers for those two of you who are new. I welcome you all. I create mental health videos as well as advocating, educating, navigating through life with Asperger's syndrome that is now classically called as autism, taking you all on a journey when I'm able with fun and games just to see what life is like for me as an ordinary adult autistic. If you're into any of these and more, feel free to smash that subscribe button on the bottom right hand corner and turn on the notification bell so don't miss any future videos. As I usually post Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but as I said, it may subject to change due to certain new things that are on the horizon. So, right, as we know, basically, as I said earlier in the real quick intro there, you may be stumped or surprised that Asperger's syndrome isn't an official diagnosis no longer, and obviously Asperger's syndrome existed as a distinctive kind of category in the Diagnostic Statistical manual of the DSM-5, which was from 1994 to 2013, or just the Diagnostic manual disorders before it was actually upgraded in 2013, 10 years later, I should say. Humbly apologize. So in saying this, basically, also, like, when it was once considered one of the 5 pervasive developmental disorders, Asperger's was folded into one general category for autism spectrum disorder. In 2013, however, due to inconsistencies in the diagnostic criteria, however, which I have shared a bit about the 2013 version or onwards of the DSM-5, which you can click in the icon above me of the playlist versus the description box below you if you want to find out more. And also in saying this, I'll be doing a more in-depth research paper on this of the New Zealand version of the DSM-5 later today in my podcast as well as on this channel. So if you want to find out more based in the New Zealand aspect, how we get diagnosed, stay tuned for that. But bear in mind also some of this research, also I forgot it as a disclaimer, some of this will be UK, US based research as well as maybe Aussie based. There is just restricted or not much resources out here for us Kiwis at the moment because they're still in the works of doing their research. So as such, US practitioners can no longer officially diagnose someone with Asperger's syndrome, right? So anyone who was given that diagnosis prior to 2013 is now considered to have autism spectrum disorder or autism spectrum in short, or even autism. Asperger's syndrome, or as it was, even though I don't like using the term disorder much, was first included as a categorical diagnosis in DSM-5 in the year of 1994. Asperger's syndrome is a pervasive developmental disorder characterized by social impairments and focused circumstantial or interest and activities in the absence of significant language impairment and cognitive delay. In both the DSM-5 IR and ICO-10 classification systems that was brought about. The full criteria for autism disorder, however, are not formally met. Since its inclusion in the DSM-5, however, there has been a dramatic increase in its recognition in children as well as in adults. Age of diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome is relatively high, the mean age being 10-11 years of age, and not infrequently occurs in adulthood. Asperger's syndrome has remained a controversial diagnosis, however, here on out today, but being difficult to distinguish clinically from autism with normal intelligence known as high-functioning autism, which I've described what high-functioning autism is versus low-functioning autism, which hopefully I'll link it in the icon above me and in the description box below me so that you can get a better understanding to what I'm sharing with you all today as well. Even though I know for a fact that this, again, I humbly apologize to the audience, don't like maybe these two terms I'm using, high-functioning versus low-functioning, because obviously, as we know, as functioning labels, which I did actually mention about also why we should maybe discourage these kind of functioning labels, and I will be listed in the icon and in the description box below me as well to find out more. The DSM-5 changes to the autism spectrum attempt to solve the continuous issue of language delays being a unique characteristic of the autism spectrum but not Asperger's syndrome alone. In the DSM-5, a criteria for Asperger's syndrome over those with the high-functioning autism with an equivalent developmental level or IQ is meeting expected language milestones in the first 3 years of a child's life. However, research has suggested that there are groups that don't, differ significantly with these very similar outcomes in adolescence and adulthood. Furthermore, there has been no evidence of differential treatment response or etiology, and claims for distinct neurocognitive profile and Asperger's syndrome have received mixed results of these diagnosis testings. Taken together, there is little evidence to support a diagnostic distinction between Asperger's syndrome and high-functioning autism, or just autism in general. Furthermore, the criteria for Asperger's syndrome and the DSM-5 has been found to be flawed and hard to implement into practice, leading to confusion for individuals and parents. Asperger's diagnosis requires establishing whether single words were spoken before the child is 2 years of age and phrases by 3 years of age. This is difficult to determine, particularly given the older age of diagnosis. In addition, the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome was intended to be applied only when criteria for autistic disorder wasn't even met. However, several studies indicate that a high number of people with diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome met criteria for autism. The inclusion of Asperger's syndrome in the DSM-5 gave recognition to the fact that people on the spectrum can have high IQ and good language skills. Harpe suggests that the DSM-5 changes reflect that it's time to reintegrate Asperger's syndrome with the rest of the spectrum and to demand the same level of respect and lack of stigma for individuals across the full range of manifestations of the spectrum. Even though, as I said before, based on this, that there has been controversies on this, which now I'm going to bring out the history of Asperger's diagnosis. As we know, basically, this came about in the year of 1940 by a clinical guy named Hans Asperger, and was placed in the DSM-5 around about the year of 1987. Came to have significant meaning for a lot of people across the United States and around the world. This was made famous by the Wired magazine article called Geek Syndrome. It came to describe people who are quirky, anxious, creative, socially challenged. The top four. Asperger's syndrome was differentiated from severe forms of autism due to these characteristics that have classically have shared. And while severe autism once went by other names as well, like autistic disorder, childhood integrative disorder is to name the few, it's now grouped under autism spectrum disorders as well. The change to the DSM-5 entry for Asperger's syndrome stemmed from concern that people with severe symptoms of autism, such as examples, non-verbal, intellectually challenged, and in need of significant daily support for basic life skills, would have the same name for their diagnosis as to those with autism who are, say, completing graduate school but having a difficult time relating to their peers or managing loud parties. To clarify the differences in these cases and alleviate confusion, the new definition of autism describes people as having a severity level between 1 and 3 based on how much support they need, which hopefully, as I said, I'll do the levels of support in a separate video, so stay tuned for that also. This, among many things, is thought to give the clinicians and others that are in that medical expert field a better sense of a person's ability to communicate, adapt, and care for themselves. Virtually everyone with a prior Asperger's syndrome diagnosis qualifies for a level 1 diagnosis, meaning in need of a relatively low level of support when they think that, these ones with Asperger's syndrome especially are, capable of doing things on their own, they're independent and whatnot. Individuals presenting for the first time with relatively mild symptoms of autism will receive a first-time diagnosis of level 1 autism spectrum disorder as well, or autism spectrum, though this may be reassessed over time. You may be questioning to why some people still use the term Asperger's syndrome or Asperger's. The decision to move Asperger's as a standalone diagnosis was somewhat controversial. Some people will say it's part of their identity, it's who they are after being diagnosed with it in the first place, and that I believe I wear that as a badge of honour regardless, but I don't dwell on it that, yeah, okay, I've got Asperger's syndrome, I have my strengths and weaknesses like anybody else, and I can share with you guys what I can and can't do and what have you. A 2017 study which analysed the effects on the decision 4 years after it was made found that moving Asperger's under the autism umbrella still has the potential to threaten the identity of those who are affected or have been diagnosed with something else, citing autism as a stigmatizing diagnostic label. While the official DSM, which is under the authority of the American Psychiatric Association, doesn't include Asperger's syndrome, however, some countries still use the diagnosis after the DSM change, and many people still use this term clinically today. For example, some advocacy groups and organisations continue to use the term to describe the group of people they serve. This may be a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that some individuals specifically identify as having Asperger's, not autism. The cultural implications since the announcement in February 2010 of the proposals to remove POD subtypes such as Asperger's syndrome as a distinct disorder in the DSM-5. There has been extensive discussion among stakeholders, including the clinicians, scientific advocacy groups, and policy makers, but particularly among those most likely to be affected, people with diagnosis of self-identified with Asperger's syndrome. The term neurodiversity was coined in the late 1900s for the already existing concept whereby members of the autistic community, together with the self-advocates representing other developmental conditions such as ADD, attention deficit disorders, and dyslexia, promoted and celebrated their differences from neurotypical peers as a positive identity, not necessarily a disability. The concept of neurodiversity, however, considers it as a typical neurological development to be normal human differences that should be accepted and respected by others, just as other differences such as those defined by class, gender, or race, or should be. From this perspective, however, autism is considered not something to be cured, but rather a way of being with both disadvantages needing a combination and advantages that can make a unique and positive contribution to society. Since the addition of the Asperger's syndrome diagnosis in the DSM-5, a distinct subculture has emerged of people with Asperger's syndrome, some of whom self-refer as Aspies, as you may have heard me used time and time again. Basically, and if you don't know what the term is of Aspies, I classified it as a clinical slang term for those who have been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. So I find it a cool kind of, title to have, Aspies. But that's my opinion. Let me know your thoughts down below. In saying this though, however, like this also, for those who self-refers themselves as Aspies, usually embrace themselves with their neurological differences. It has been suggested that this independent culture relies upon a restrictive view of high-functioning autism as being distinct from others on the spectrum. And so whilst autism conditions associated with low functioning may be considered disorders requiring treatment, the higher functioning characteristics of Asperger's shouldn't be pathologized as a disorder and subsumed under the category of autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, in the DSM-5. Controversially, and some in the autistic community have an adherence of being classified as either high functioning or low functioning. Rather, those diagnosed with self-identifying anywhere on the spectrum are welcomed and accommodated. New Zealand ASD guidelines and military paper on the implications of DSM-5 for the diagnosis of ASD will be, as I said, will come into effect with this a bit more, so you can gain a better understanding of how it's diagnosed in New Zealand, especially since I'm a New Zealand Kiwi. So, identity. For many people with Asperger's syndrome, as with autism disorder, more broadly, the diagnosis has come after years of anxiety and confusion and represents a turning point in their lives. Frequently, individuals who are diagnosed in adolescence or adulthood report that receiving a diagnosis results in a conceptual framework that helps explain past experiences, creates greater self-understanding, leads to informal support, and an awareness of additional services options that are hopefully readily available for that particular someone. Closing the diagnosis can have its pitfalls, however, or downfalls, and is best approached with care. People who don't seek a formal diagnosis, the desire to self-identify as having Asperger's syndrome or ASD and to join the AS or ASD culture or community may be driven by the understanding, acceptance and support that such a community can offer to them. Alongside the growing professional recognition and debate around Asperger's syndrome before and since its inclusion in the DSM-5, as I said, awareness of Asperger's syndrome and autism more generally is becoming part of the mainstream culture today, facilitated by public awareness initiatives and fictional media portrayals over the past decades, such as like Sheldon in The Big Bang Theory, the guy from The Rain Man, so on and so forth. And the title characters in House and Monk especially was led to thought that they were autistic as well, based on the characters maybe that weren't actually have Asperger's syndrome themselves or autism. Linking autism to famous individuals, however, or intellectual and initiative thinkers contributes to view of people with AS as a high group of highly intelligent individuals with autism, include highly intelligent, successful individuals making positive contributions to society. Embracing these positive images has being people who are diagnosed, self-diagnosed, or associate themselves with AS who have developed a positive identity of Asperger's syndrome beyond the diagnostic boundaries. However, an extreme emphasis on positives also have negative implications or ramifications, such as instances of subcultures promoting Aspie supremacy that cause other individuals with autism, including many with AS, further isolation, disadvantage, and or stigmatized. A study including interviews with 19 adults with AS and analyzing using ground theory illustrated that how the diagnosis and self-diagnosis of AS is fused with a strong and positive individual identity. For some, diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome being labeled autistic and associated with people at the lower end of the autism spectrum is a problematic and particularly stigmatizing for those that has it. The negative stereotypes placed on autism may stem from a lack of understanding among the general public of the variability in symptoms among people on the autism spectrum. Jana and Lala suggest that those with Asperger's syndrome who are able to live independent lives in the right environment but may find the notion of their condition being combined with lower functioning autism in the DSM-5 and even worse stigmatization. It suggested that instead of being labelled using use-based language such as people should be considered as having a particular vulnerability. Tony Atwood, a psychologist specialising in the working with people with AS, believes the new criteria may create further social confusion. The problem is the condition but the attitude of other people, he stated. When you're young, self-esteem is created with a peer group, not from your mum or dad. Teenagers may not worry that their peers may have an idea of autism. The public see autism as a severe disability. However, people may think the person is lying or deluded if they say they're autistic. It's been hypothesized that under the new DSM-5 criteria, a perceived stigma attached to autism may inhibit disclosure and self-identification with Asperger's syndrome, and as a result cut off attendant benefits of diagnosis, including the development of meaningful self-identities and gaining legitimacy. Such a stigma by association stems from negative stereotypes placed on autism and lack of understanding by the general public about the vulnerability and symptoms among people on the autism spectrum. Dispelling stigma around autism, ensuring balanced information upon diagnosis, and providing well-informed support around disclosure are likely to assist in addressing issues around identity for those on the spectrum. The ESD guideline includes a recommendation relating to stigma, and ESD anti-discrimination and destigmatization campaign should be developed. Discussions about the potential loss of identity from the removal of PDDS from the DSM-5 tend to focus on the removal of AS rather than the PDNOS and childhood disintegrative disorder, which appear to have a less distinct culture. It could be argued that including AS in the diagnostic classification of the autism spectrum may increase the recognition of breadth and variability of the condition, and so over time the stigma attached to the label of autism would be reduced as the positive association with AS because associated with the broader condition of ASD. Inclusion may also be advantageous to many people with AS who feel that the challenges they face socially are underestimated and who are already illustrated or who are already chosen to be autistic for that identity for these and other reasons. The emerging positive image of AS in society can be a double-edged sword, however, as illustrated by the comment from this parent of a child with Asperger's syndrome. In fact, as soon as you say Asperger's, people immediately think gifted, superior, savant. That's why I always use the term high-functioning autism to describe Darcy to minimize any unrealistic expectation of him. However, whilst not wanting neurological difference to be medicalized and treated as a disorder, people anywhere on the autism spectrum may still require special treatment or care provisions, allowances and support. People identifying as having AS with or without an official diagnosis discuss facing everyday challenges of communication, social interaction and misunderstanding. They talk of struggles leading to social isolation and feeling misunderstood, and feelings of anxiety, guilt and sense of shame. Such challenges are expected to persist despite the changes to nomenclature in the DSM-5. For such people who don't seek a formal diagnosis, desires to self-identify as having AS may be driven by their understanding, acceptance and support that belonging to such a community can offer. An advantage of the DSM-5's emphasis on individualized assessment and severity ratings supplemented by personal strength-based characteristics is that it can affect direct needs-based support. People who are functioning well and require no formal intervention for some aspects of their functioning can have this recorded through based associated severity ratings, or in some cases where no support is needed, seek no formal diagnosis. Some people will continue to have the option to seek identity, peer support and understanding from others in the ASD community, made up as it always has been with the individual rights across the spectrum, or may any Aspie or other subcultures. This choice also takes the definition and control of the word Aspergers of the domain of a deficit-based classification system of mental illnesses, quote unquote, and into the hands of those who choose to name and claim their own moniker. Several autism organisations have been cautiously positive about these DSM-5 changes. The National Autistic Society in the UK welcomes the overall approach, stating that the diagnostic criteria are helpful, clearer and simpler than the previous DSM-5 criteria, and approve the development of dimensional measures of severity, inclusion of sensory behaviours, and the emphasis on identifying the full range of difficulties that an individual has. With respect to AS, they note that diagnosticians might still use the term colloquially referring to a person as having ASD of the Asperger's type, adding that many people who identify closely with the term Asperger's syndrome will continue to use it in their everyday life. The Asperger's Society of Ontario suggests that it may make it easier for people to understand what Asperger's syndrome is by folding it into the ASD banner, noting when asked to describe Asperger's, most explain it as a high-functioning form of autism. It's not clear what impact the changes in the DSM-5 will have in New Zealand or internationally. However, there is no reason that self-advocates, families and advocacy organisations cannot continue to use the term Asperger's syndrome, or that people may benefit from joining groups that define themselves in this term of previous definitions. Medical diagnosis aren't intended to define person or capture the complexity of an individual's culture or cultural identity and unique personal history. Even though the formal diagnosis may be autism spectrum disorder, individuals who are familiar with Asperger's syndrome diagnosis can make reference to it on their medical file. This is already the case to help people with high functioning autism, which isn't a formal clinical diagnosis but is a term used by clinicians and affected individuals to assist in understanding and describing the condition. As the various terms as autis, Aspian, Aspergers, Autis and Aspergian continue to carry meaning and value for a self-selecting community, they are likely to continue to be using these clinical slang terms. And so just as broader, richer autistic community and culture have developed independently from and beyond a manualized classification of autistic conditions, terms such as Asperger's and Aspie may continue to have a life as identities distinct from a diagnostic classification. Medical consensus continues to move away from the Asperger's diagnosis, however, following the DSM-5s or DSM's lead, the 11th revision of the International Classification of Diseases have moved Asperger's syndrome under the autism spectrum umbrella. IDC 11 takes effect in January 1st, 2022 and will be used by all World Health Organization member state. So this quickly ends obviously some parts of the topic. Asperger's syndrome is no longer a diagnosis. If you want to find out more about what I share, I've got some autistic videos which you can hopefully find on the end card, which is based on Help Central or anything like that, as well as some other various topics maybe that will come into effect, as I said earlier in the piece, to branch it out and the timestamps for you guys so you can get to know more about what it's all about, especially since I'm sharing it all with you all. So without further ado guys, thanks for your support, thanks for watching, and don't forget, as I said before, while I've been MIA for a while, I've been busy working on my projects on what I'm hoping to bring out to you, which obviously at this point of time is in the works at the moment. I'm hoping not to say much until it's fully done up, which you'll hopefully have to sit tight for what I shared like a few days ago based on this. I don't know how many days ago it was, but if you want to support me on my future endeavours of advocating, educating, navigating with you all with autism and mental health especially, as well as doing these future projects that I'm working on or working towards, which is my, as I said, my merch versus my website that hopefully will come into effect as of next year sometime and whatnot, feel free to donate big or small on the description box below of Patreon. For those of you who have landed on my page today, for those of you who don't know it, Patreon is like a crowdfunding page, but not quite, but it's just a special page for creators, content creators, music creators, or whoever that requires funds to support whatever they need it for, be it if it's for their rent, their travel, their equipment that they're using to upgrade, or stuff like I'm doing right now as I'm doing my podcast versus my website and everything else, which I'll badly need soon, some new software versus maybe equipment soon, so that everything will run smoothly for me. You don't have to donate big. If it's a small amount, it will be much appreciated, because every bit counts to support me in my future endeavours, what I'm doing for these projects. If you want me to advocate more, especially here in New Zealand, because as I said in one of my videos 2 years ago on the autism related ones, that was on the autism videos, especially of the Autism Awareness Month or acceptance, support people and whatnot, so to speak, based on the needs for people like me that are autistic or goes through mental health. So, and over to the guys, thanks for support, thanks for watching, do what love, do. Until next time, I'll see you again soon, and enjoy your day.